You begin with the assumption that you control your inner world. You believe that thoughts arise because you choose them, emotions appear because you manage them, and decisions reflect your stable autonomy. Yet if you look closely, you notice moments when thoughts appear without permission, actions occur without prior intention, and reactions unfold faster than conscious choice. Al-Ghazali observed this tension early in his inquiry. He realized that the idea of full control is not confirmed by experience, it is assumed because it feels stabilizing. The more he examined it, the more fragile it appeared. You begin to ask, if control were truly yours, why would your own mind contradict you so often? Al-Ghazali lived in a world governed by rational argument and structured decision-making. Scholars defended doctrines. Philosophers constructed systems. Jurists imposed intellectual discipline. Everyone believed that the mind could be mastered through effort and training. Yet Al-Ghazali noticed that beneath this structured world operated forces no one fully understood. Scholars preached stability but privately struggled with inner conflict. This observation shaped his insight. The idea of control is not validated by reason, it is maintained by belief. As Al-Ghazali examined his own mind, he noticed that thoughts did not follow his commands. They appeared, disappeared, and repeated themselves without consultation. Desires arose spontaneously. Fears resurfaced without invitation. The idea that he governed these processes did not match reality. You begin to observe the same. A thought interrupts your intention. A reaction contradicts your values. A habit continues despite your decisions. Instead of demonstrating control, these moments reveal autonomy within the mind, a movement independent of your will. This raised the essential question for Al-Ghazali: if the mind does not obey, who or what is truly in control? Control appears compelling because it creates a sense of security. You assume that if you are in control, you can manage outcomes, avoid uncertainty, and shape your life according to expectation. But this assumption begins to weaken as you observe your inner processes carefully. Al-Ghazali analyzed the structure of control and found that it rests on two hidden premises. The belief that intention precedes action. The belief that thought produces itself according to will. When he examined these assumptions, both collapsed. Many actions occur before intention is formed. Many thoughts arise before you decide anything. The mind operates according to its own patterns, shaped by memory, conditioning, and unconscious tendencies. Control exists mainly as a retrospective explanation, not as a moment-to-moment reality. You start to see this in your everyday functioning. You justify your actions after they occur. You explain your thoughts after they arise. Control becomes a narrative added to experience, not a description of the experience itself. Al-Ghazali recognized that this narrative is comforting but inaccurate. The illusion persists because the reality feels unsettling. But if the illusion is exposed, clarity becomes possible. And so the question emerges: is control something you perform or something you imagine? You notice that thoughts arise with their own momentum. A memory emerges without being summoned. A judgment appears without being selected. A worry intensifies without your approval. These movements demonstrate that the mind functions independently of intention. Al-Ghazali concluded that thought has autonomy. It behaves according to internal mechanisms rather than conscious direction. He saw that the mind is more like a field of activity than a tool of command. Its patterns unfold according to causes that the thinker does not control. You begin to examine this more directly. When a thought appears, you notice that you did not choose its content or its timing. When an emotion follows, you notice that you did not engineer its intensity. The idea that you created these experiences becomes less convincing. This recognition weakens the illusion of authorship. You realize that thought is not the product of a single controlling entity but the interaction of countless internal factors. The mind is active, but not obedient. This insight shifts your understanding. Control is not absent, it was never as absolute as you assumed. As you observe the mind further, you notice distinct patterns. Certain thoughts repeat regardless of intention. Certain reactions persist despite decisions to change. Certain habits continue even when you intellectually reject them. Al-Ghazali understood these patterns as reflections of deeper conditioning. They arise from memories, expectations, unresolved conflicts, and habitual responses. The mind loops through these patterns without conscious participation. What you consider your thinking is often the repetition of previously formed structures. You begin to see this clearly. The mind reacts before you evaluate. It concludes before you analyze. It predicts before you examine evidence. These automatic processes occur whether or not you intend them. This recognition dissolves the belief that control governs your inner life. You have influence, but not absolute authority. You can observe, adjust, refine, and redirect, but you cannot force the mind to behave according to will alone. Al-Ghazali viewed this not as defeat but as discovery. When you stop assuming total control, you become more accurate about how the mind truly functions. You no longer blame yourself for patterns that arose independently. You begin to cultivate understanding instead of frustration. And so a new insight forms. Awareness begins when the illusion of control ends. When you believe you control your mind completely, you imagine a unified self directing every internal process. But when you examine experience closely, this self appears less like an entity and more like an explanation added after the fact. Al-Ghazali recognized that the self constructed by thought is a conceptual center, not an actual controller. It organizes experience into a narrative of me, but it does not initiate experience. The self claims ownership of thoughts that arise independently and decisions shaped long before conscious awareness. You begin to see this mechanism in yourself. After a thought appears, the self claims it. After an action occurs, the self takes credit. After a reaction unfolds, the self assigns meaning. The self is not the source of control, it is the interpreter of events that have already happened. This interpretation is not malicious. It is habitual, but it creates the illusion of authorship. When the illusion weakens, you stop identifying with every thought and action. You begin to observe them without feeling obligated to claim them. This leads to a quiet shift. The more closely you examine the self, the less central it becomes. You start to see that control is attributed to the self, not exercised by it. As the illusion of control fades, something else emerges, something that Al-Ghazali recognized as the beginning of real clarity. When you stop insisting on controlling the mind, you begin observing it. This observation is not passive, it is precise. It allows you to understand internal processes as they are, rather than as you wish them to be. Observation reveals structure. You begin to see why certain thoughts arise. You notice which emotions follow them. You detect the conditions that activate specific reactions. This insight does not give you control, but it gives you understanding, and understanding produces influence. Al-Ghazali distinguished between control and influence. Control is the belief that you can force outcomes. Influence is the capacity to shape conditions. Thought cannot be commanded, but conditions can be altered. Awareness changes the environment in which thoughts arise. You begin to see that the mind becomes more orderly when watched. Patterns weaken when recognized. Habits dissolve when understood. Emotional reactions soften when observed without resistance. None of this is control, yet all of it is transformation. This leads to an unexpected realization. You cannot control the mind, but the mind changes in the presence of awareness. Once you understand that control is an illusion, you stop trying to manage thought through force. You no longer attempt to suppress unwanted experiences or compel clarity. This release of effort creates a new kind of stability. Ghazali believed that the attempt to impose control creates more disturbance. When you try to restrain thought, resistance increases. When you try to silence the mind, agitation intensifies. When you try to force stillness, tension grows. You now begin to see this in yourself. The more you try to fix your inner world through command, the more chaotic it becomes. But when you observe without resistance, activity settles on its own. Thoughts become less intrusive. Emotions become less reactive. The mind organizes itself without coercion. Effort dissolves. Clarity arises. You realize the paradox. The mind is not controlled into peace. It relaxes into peace when control ends. This removes the pressure to achieve a certain inner state. You no longer chase stability. You stop viewing internal movement as failure. You see that the mind's natural rhythm includes fluctuation. Stillness arises not through domination but through understanding. And in that understanding, you become quieter. As the inquiry deepens, the illusion of control loses its foundation. You no longer imagine a separate self managing the mind. You no longer interpret every thought as a deliberate choice. You no longer assume internal coherence where there is complexity. Ghazali saw that true clarity begins when the mind stops pretending to be the engine of all its activity. When the pretense ends, the conflict ends. When conflict ends, peace appears, not as an achievement, but as the absence of strain. You begin to feel the difference. Thinking continues, but it no longer claims authority. Emotions arise, but they no longer define you. Actions occur, but they no longer require narrative justification. There is no need for control when control was never real. There is only the recognition of processes unfolding and the understanding that awareness can meet them without manipulation. Now the inner world becomes simpler. The mind moves. Awareness sees. Nothing needs to be forced. This leads to the final insight. Freedom does not come from controlling the mind. It comes from no longer needing to. As the inquiry settles, the mind becomes quiet. Not because you mastered it, but because you stopped demanding mastery. Thought moves freely. Awareness observes quietly. There is no conflict between the two. Ghazali understood that the illusion of control creates tension, but its dissolution creates clarity. When the mind is no longer pressured, it functions cleanly. When the self no longer claims authorship, experience becomes lighter. Stillness emerges when the struggle ends. Nothing needs to be managed. Nothing needs to be resisted. Nothing needs to be controlled. What remains is simplicity. And in simplicity, peace appears on its own.